Well, welcome back to our class. We are in week 7. Wow, it's hard to believe. No, week 6. Week 6 is where we are. Uh, Please forgive confusion on my part. Sometimes preaching on a Sunday gives you a long day at church, and yesterday I had plenty enough to talk about, including apologetics, due to some questions being asked. What we're going to do here is talk about the uniqueness of the human person in chapter 17. Then we're going to talk about royalty deposed in chapter 18. Now, 17 is a challenge. I've tried to mention to you several times here which chapters that I think are the most difficult, and chapter 17 is one of those. Chapter 18, much simpler. A lot of it has to do with, I think, our accessibility to things like science and the law, and also philosophy. And so, if you've had a lot of science and a lot of philosophy, chapter 17 should be a breeze. If not, you can probably struggle a little bit with it. We probably all struggle with it just a little bit. Now, let me just say that we are coming up to the third exam, maybe the end of this week, and so make sure you're prepared for that. It'd be like the other exams. Um, Let me also just say to you that uh, this has been a good time for me. I've enjoyed putting all this stuff together, even though the videos have been in some ways challenging. Not so much taking the video as transporting them to you. But I'm glad you've been patient with me. And so we're going to go from here. Now, we'll keep this short. I just want to cover some of the key points that he makes in chapters 17 and 18. And in chapter 17, he talks about the uniqueness of humanity over against the rest of the created order. Now, that's an important point to make apologetically, because it is important to see humans as being in some ways distinct, not only from rocks and trees, but also from the animal kingdom, also distinct from God. But standing in a sort of a midway position. We are physical creatures. We live in a physical, natural world, which God made and considered to be good. But by the same token, we are creatures who have something more. There's a consciousness. There's an awareness of something beyond this world. There's the ability to think and be creative, to write sonnets like Shakespeare, or sonnets that are not like Shakespeare, like some that I wrote when I was a young person. Nothing approximating Shakespeare. You've never heard my name mentioned with reference to poetry. But there's something unique about humanity. And so he delves into it here in chapter 17. And maybe the best way I could do to just kind of set this up, and then I'll look at a couple of high points, is that historically there have been three views about how we understand the human condition with reference to the fact that we are body, and yet we seem to be something more than just body. There seems to be something there. Some have called it the soul. In fact, if you were to go back even to philosophy before the New Testament was written, this recognition that there is a soul on the part of Plato and some of the Platonic philosophers who followed him indicate that for this thinker at least, he was at least intuitively recognizing something that we've all come to experience, even if we've never thought about it this way, and that is that out here around us, there's a show, but in here, in the mind, there's the show that takes place between our ears. And somehow we're able to digest that, to perceive it, to think about it, to rationalize about it, more so than, as best as we can tell, the animal kingdom. I have 4 dogs and 2 cats who have occasionally intruded upon these lectures, and my dogs and cats recognize certain stimuli. We have about a quarter-mile long driveway from the road to our home, to our house. It's a gravel driveway, and from the time that I turn onto that gravel driveway, even though I'm off in the trees and cannot be seen by anyone or anything, my dogs get excited because they know I'm coming home. And they also recognize the difference between my car and other people's cars, because I have paid attention to that. That if I'm at home and somebody comes up, they'll stand and look, watch out through the fence. But if it's me coming home, then they get really excited for whatever reason, probably not the least of which is that I feed them. And if I'm gone out for some part of the day, I normally bring them a little bit of a snack. I guess I'm just a pushover. They respond to stimuli like that. They respond to the stimulus of hunger, respond to a variety of different things. I can call their names. They know their names. They know each other's names. If I refer to my wife and I say, go see mama, they'll go see mama. So they have some ability to cognitively recognize certain stimuli. But I would never think of my dog as thinking about the opening pages of Calvin's Institutes, or thinking about the anthropic cosmological principle, or any of those things like that. So there's something about us. There's the show, and there's the show between the ears. Now that perspective is called dualism. And dualism is one of those odd words that's used in a variety of different ways in philosophy and in theology. And so if somebody says, well, you're just a dualist, ask them what they're talking about, because dualism can refer to the idea that there are two gods. In Zoroastrianism, that's what it means. There is Ahura Mazda, and then there's Shaitan. So that's a dualism, but that's what we might call a metaphysical dualism beyond the physical realm. And there are other ways of thinking of dualisms, but here we're going to use the term in reference to the relation between the mind and the body. So dualism, that's kind of in the middle. Off on one side of dualism, there's what is called materialism. And what our author does is spend a lot of time distinguishing between the materialistic worldview and the dualistic worldview, and opting for some form of dualism, anthropological dualism, which just means dualism in reference to the human person, over against materialism. And I think that this is probably one of the places where non-theism, and especially non-Christian theism, but non-theism of any kind, atheism and so on, where they have the hardest time. Because what they're trying to argue is that there is no stuff but stuff. And yet the very human existence, as he will talk about in here, the fact that I say to my wife, I love you, and I mean something by that other than, is dinner ready yet? I think is a compelling argument. So though the argument is challenging, please work through it maybe a couple of times. So dualism in the middle, materialism off on one side. On the other side would be immaterialism. And immaterialism is the idea that there is no such thing as extension. Now the term extension there is used philosophically to refer to the idea that we have physical things in the world. My body's physical, my home is physical, my acreage that I live on is physical. There have been philosophers who have argued against the notion of the existence of the material world, that in some sense it's either an illusion or it is something that God makes moment by moment. And it might surprise you who some of the key immaterialists have been. Certainly Jonathan Edwards, one of my heroes theologically, was sort of a modified immaterialist. He believed that I'm a created being, but he believed that every successive moment was a new creation of God. That's in his book on original sin. If you want to look that up in that book and read that, please do. By the way, be ready for a mental workout when you read any of Edwards' theological treatises. But he opts for dualism, this idea that we have this show out here, the existence of the material world, and then the show between our ears in which we have cognition of that, in which we process that. And so pay attention to the kinds of arguments he uses in this chapter against the purely materialists. And then in chapter 18, he moves on and wants to talk about what he calls deposed royalty, Pascal's anthropological argument. Starts out with a quote from Abraham Heschel: "The Bible is God's anthropology rather than man's theology," and then offers an interesting, I think, and very helpful critique of that sort of an idea. He cashes in on, in this chapter, I think, some things that Francis Schaeffer is well known for. And if you've read this book by Grotius carefully, you will notice Francis Schaeffer's name comes up quite frequently, along with William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland and Paul Copan and a few others. But many contemporary apologists find in Schaeffer, Francis Schaeffer, who died in the early 1980s, to be a very helpful person when it comes to offering an apologetic. Schaeffer, of course, lived with his wife Edith at a chalet in Switzerland called the Brie, and they brought in all kinds of disaffected young people, oftentimes wealthy children of American families who were agnostic or atheist or nihilist or existentialist, and Schaeffer had quite a remarkable ability to help them. And where he keys off here, and he doesn't necessarily give a lot of credit to Schaeffer, but I think that Schaeffer is the one person who has said this more carefully than others, is that man is both noble and miserable at the same time. And of course, this chapter relates primarily to Pascal, and Pascal had said many of the same things, that there's something noble because we have this connecting point between ourselves and God, something we can consider rationally. And again, I think my animals have a connecting point with God, but I don't believe they think about that rationally. And they probably substitute me or my wife for the position of God. Well, my wife is probably God, and I'm probably the devil, so they're probably metaphysical dualists. But at least I keep them fed. He goes into a discussion and says that philosophy doesn't always help us a lot here, but if we went to the Bible has an adequate explanation for the fact that we have these high aspirations and yet a sense of low fulfillment. But the question is, where does the high aspiration come from? How was it and why is it that we know some things should be right and some things should be wrong? I was speaking with the youth minister at a church that I have been preaching at lately last night, and he conveyed to me the fact that even in a little Tennessee town of about 5,000 people, at the junior high and high school level, homosexuality has become pretty much a given. And he said, I don't really know how to respond to my youth when they come to me and say, people who oppose homosexual marriage are bigots, and other things like that. I think that getting some perspective on both the nobility and the tragedy of human life, both at the same time, is something that is important for us in dealing with ethics, but also in dealing with the truth of whether or not we are in fact creatures made by God. Well, I hope you'll read these two chapters and appreciate them. Chapter 18 is easier than chapter 17, but both of them help us to see that there is an anthropology here, a study of the human condition. And that's an important thing for us to understand. So we'll see you again here in a day or two.